phone. You can't. Okay, we're on. Welcome everyone to readings from the archives of the Gunn Historical Museum. This program today at the Washington Senior Center, thanks for hosting us, was originally scheduled a couple months ago, and it was postponed due to the snowstorm, so we have rescheduled for today. And weather's a little bit different today. We have a heat index of around 100, so thank you all for coming out to hear more about the history of New Preston. For those of you who haven't been to one of these programs before, we select a paper from the museum's archive, and I read it, and I bring photos and artifacts to look at that correspond to the presentation. And today the photos are again in digital format, so we have them up on the screen here. And Doug Mchan also brought some of his collection here, which is on display out on the table. And today's paper is A Walk Through New Preston in the 1960s, written by Doug Mchan in 2015. And after the presentation today, we could have a brief discussion about the paper, and perhaps there's some names that you remember or some more information that you could add about the things that are mentioned today. So let's start off. It starts with the Pavilion Hall, also known as the Boys Club, is my first stop. I don't remember the post office being there, but I remember someone selling fireworks in front of the building. I do not know who this was the benefit for. Do you? On the left, front part of the building, the fire truck was stored. When the fire siren was sounded, I sure knew about it. We lived 2 houses up at 30 East Shore Road, and my bedroom was on the south side, which was in line with the cupola. More often than not, Bill Jessen was the first to reach the firehouse pavilion. He operated the package store in town and lived next door. He could really run for a big guy. When the siren sounded, a light would light up, and the first one there would answer the phone, then write the address on the chalkboard for the latecomers to see. Whoever was there would jump on the fire truck and go. If the battery was dead, they would push it down the short grade just outside the barn doors to jumpstart it. I was lucky enough to be there the day that Ed Meeker had installed the 2-way radios and was showing the firemen how to use it. The only thing I remember him saying was, "Nope, it won't work on Beebrook Road, no reception." My earliest memories of the hall. Ralph Swanson was the caretaker of the hall. He kept the coal stove going. The neighborhood boys would open the coal chute door and make ghostly sounds. Then he would respond, "Close the door, it's cold." He had a dog named Zip, who was his constant companion. Zip was a nice dog. Another memory is the play put on by the New Preston Congregational Church with Janet and Phil Young, who were still in school at the time. The curtains on the stage had a painting of the lake, and around the edges were white blocks with advertising in them. Norman W. Couch and Couch Brothers Garage were on them. I do not know who painted them or what the other advertisements were. Do you? Even before the boys' club opened, we were sometimes allowed to go in and play basketball. Dorothy Averill and some of her friends came up with the idea of a place where boys could go, play, and stay out of trouble. Mr. Mason rented the downstairs apartment in the Garnett's house, which was the second house towards the lake from the boys' club. He was the first director of the boys' club and was a good choice for the job. He asked a bunch of us kids to pick up, clean, and paint the building. Bobby Gillette was the first to sign up as a member. I was number 13, and I still have my membership card. One time, I made 23 baskets in a row. from the corner, but I never learned how to dribble the ball. We played pool, ping pong, watched TV, or a movie. Sure wish kids today would get together at the club and do all these things. The New Preston Congregational Church held rummage sales here in the spring and fall for many years. I bought a small mantel clock from Hattie Smith for 25 cents at one of these sales. If anyone has pictures of the inside of the building, could I make a copy? Jerry Smith was the janitor and also worked for Bob Woodruff at the mill. In the summer evenings, a group of older men would gather on the steps of the hall or on the porch of the supply company to talk and tell stories. Ralph Swanson, Stomper Swift, Banjo Cervides, and Jerry Smith were the main ones. I don't remember any of the many stories I heard, but I do remember they never swore in front of us boys. In recent history, when some boards were being replaced from the right part of the building, I was able to save them. I have made a frame to fit over a copy of the July 4th, 1984 issue of The New Yorker that had an artist rendition of the Pavilion Hall with the lake just outside the rear of the building. Jerry had a very bad leg that turned in when he walked. Heard at one time he was a barn stormer. It never slowed him down one bit. He lived a stone's throw from Woodruff's mill. Jerry sang in the New Preston Church Choir. I don't remember much about the library except Hattie Smith, Jerry Smith's sister, was the librarian. She was so nice. I went to the library as a young boy with my mother. One of the double-sided bookcases is still used at the Pavilion Hall. This building was moved to a private home off Gun Hill Road, then again to a house near the Lake Warramog State Park. I would love to see it. Across the river from Pavilion Hall was Swanson's. Before my time, they were a trucking company delivering coal, a livery service, taxi, had gas pumps, and many more services. We have a picture of my dad, Wes Mchan, standing in front of the gas pumps. We also have his gold wristwatch from when the business closed. Clifford and Anna Wright, she was the town's tax collector, lived there with Leo and Eleanor Toots Pickett, Millie Wright, their daughters, along with Toots and Leo's children. Before Dad married, he also lived there. I believe some other boarders were Al Anderson and Charlie Pitts, who both worked for the State Highway Department. I spent a lot of time playing there with my cousins Leo and Jim Pickett. They must have played a million games of wiffle ball with the doors of the small roadside garage doors as backstop. There were too many windows, the river, and the road to play hardball. They had a 16-inch bike that many kids in town learned to ride on. Near the end of the walkway, there was a flat spot. Before my time, there was a newspaper stand there. It was great for coasting right down to where they kept the New Preston town trucks. There were 2 Diamond T dump trucks, and Leo Pickett drove the International pickup, which was the first one I ever saw with a dump body. The trucks were kept in the big barn straight ahead on the property from the road. They kept the road grader in the portion of the barn backing towards the river. The New Preston town crew I remember are Nort Ives, Jim Gillette Sr., my future father-in-law Buck Butler, and the grader operator was named Peter or Pete. I believe he lived at the end of Baldwin Hill Road at Peterson's overnight guests. Between the 2 garages, you can still see the foundation of the ice house. I can remember going once with Dad to deliver ice somewhere around the lake. We started out on the left side, West Shore Drive. Hearing a noise, Dad pulled into the end of Tinker Hill Road just in time for us to see the seaplane land on the lake. Swanson's property was where the E.J. Kelly bus stop and turnaround was. They came 2 times a day. We became friends with the driver and found out he and his son repaired bikes. I think his son was in a wheelchair. I thought it was great they would pick up and deliver right to us so we didn't have to bug Dad to take bike stuff to Johnny Bongero's Western Auto on the Green in New Milford. Leo and Toots' oldest son, Orv, had an English 3-speed bike. That was the first one I ever saw. After Orv bought his first car, a 62 Buick Special convertible, we got to ride the bike. It didn't have brakes, but we would put our heel on the frame and rub against the tires. Not very good for shoes, though. One of the dumbest things I ever did was take my sled up New Preston Hill Road and slide down the gutter to the bridge. New Preston Hill had a huge field where Clyde Coles and his Chevy Coupe and Richard Stewart with his Oldsmobile would drive us kids around. I don't remember sledding there, but after Clyde and Richard got their licenses, they left the Oldsmobile hood behind. It was all we could do to pull it up the hill with a piece of clothesline. And it was worth it. It went very fast and would sometimes spin around. Cresselt's store was run by Alvin and Pearl Cresselt in my day. They were great people. Alvin was a little rough around the edges, but a good man. They had candy, car magazines, comic books, and soda. What more could a young boy need? Back then, everyone in town would send their very young children with a list to the store. The kids would give it to Alvin, and he would get the items together, which may have included cutting meat to order. The kids would come with the money, or their dads would come the next day to pay. My dad would stop there every day to get the daily news paper. Things were different on Sunday. The front counter would be cleared to make room for the many Sunday papers. Corky Cresselt and Buster Dano ran this operation most of the time. Somehow, we kids found out about Mountain Dew's soda slogan, "It'll tickle your innards." We pestered Alvin until he bought it, but we hated it. Once Pete Smith and I were asked to help unload the weekly delivery of the Bazzuto's trailer truck. We had a lot of fun throwing boxes, and most of the time catching them. I don't think we were ever invited back to help. Alvin and Pearl's apartment was upstairs, along with, I believe, Alvin's mother. His mother was blind. To get around the apartment, she counted her steps and turns. One day, Donnie Westcott was visiting, I think watching TV on a 4-inch screen. Leaving his feet in the hallway, she tripped. She was okay in the end. If you crossed the bridge, you would see the toilet flush directly into the East Aspetuck River. When I think back, playing with the picket boys in the river, it sure wasn't a good idea. But in those days, just about everyone on the river did the same. I can't imagine the hardship it must have been when the state came in, poured colored dye down the toilets, and then watched the river to see if it came out, because you had to fix the problem. I would imagine this is why Alvin and Pearl moved into the old barbershop building, which used to stand on East Shore Road across from Pavilion Hall. Homer Underwood moved it onto the hill that stands between Main Street and Schwab Road. The only items we have from the store is a Honey Stoeffler photo and some comic books. We always called the building across the river behind Cresselt's Fanny's. I believe the full name was Fanny Heft. Before my time, there was a restaurant on the main floor. My mother told me the small room on the right side of the building was the doctor that delivered her. Billy Bader had a picture of him in his carriage. In later years, Skip Showalter was running threaded rods through the building to hold it together, and found spoons in the walls. Clifford Wright had the biggest collection of tools he kept downstairs in this building. I think it was the best one I've ever seen. Upstairs was used for storage by many people in town. Toots Eleanor Pickett let me go shopping for furniture when I bought my house in 1980. Shortly after, the building was taken down. I still have an enamel bedpan and a few other things from there. The first section of the Washington Supply Building was the Singer sewing machine man. His name was Donald Simpson. He lived on Route 47 heading towards Woodbury. He was a tall man and very soft-spoken. I believe he sold and repaired the machines. We have a thimble from there. In the next section of the building was the barber shop. Rocco was the first barber I knew. I assume he and Norman Erickson worked together for a while, as there were 2 customer chairs. Then it was sold to Norman. Norman sold nap shoes on the side. There was always a nap calendar hanging on the wall. When Norman wasn't busy, we would gather on the end of the supply company porch to talk about last week's races in Danbury and make predictions on the upcoming week of racing. We have the motorized barber pole and clock from the barber shop. Before this pole, they had a half-round enameled barber pole. The New Preston branch of the Washington Supply Company was a place I went often. I couldn't tell you the number of times I went there to have Harold Connerty or Alvin Peterson get me a half-pound of 10-penny nails for the latest addition to the treehouse I built, along with much help from Billy and Irving Wyant and Chick and Bobby Pinney. It had 3 rooms and a workshop under it. We used to buy domes of silence, furniture feet to be used as cheap cleats for our shoes. The right side of the building was where the deliveries were made. We called it the feed room. Yes, we did have farms back then. My father, Wes, who only had 2 jobs in his lifetime, made the deliveries from the store in Washington to New Preston. The rest of the store was filled with rows of shelves and tables full of anything you would need. To me, the best part were the boxes of model cars stacked in the right front window. I would study them all, calculating which one to get next. With my 35-cent allowance from lawn mowing and snow shoveling. Sometimes the chrome pieces would be taken or missing from the boxes, and they would be marked NG and moved to the office shelf. This meant no good. If I was lucky, Harold would give them to my dad, who in turn would give them to me. When Craig Nelson was closing his store, the Village Barn, and moving his items out, he took pictures of the floor in the left rear section of the building, where there was a row of different sized holes. The supply company kept coils of rope in the basement to save room on the counters. So the rope was threaded through the basement. Was threaded through these holes. Craig also found a 2 by 10 foot supply company sign in the basement, which he was kind enough to give us. We have 2 yardsticks from here. One is a John Deere. The other one has the 3-digit phone number and on the back a measurer for dipping into your oil tank, as they sold home heating oil at that time, eventually selling that section to Hoffman Fuel. The front porch on the left side of the building was put on after the supply company was gone. Harold used to park his car in this alley. One story I heard about Alvin Peterson was of him parking his 1950 Plymouth business coupe in front of the supply company. And one day he pulled up to the curb, misjudging the distance, hit the curb, hitting his head on the horn button. Alvin was very height challenged. If you have a copy of the Washington Volunteer Fire Department book, 1926 to 2001, on page 25, you'll see Albin's 1950 Plymouth in front of the New Preston barber shop. Also, you can see the library in the corner of the parking lot. Does anyone know whose car it is next to the library in that photo? The short pointed sign, I believe, is for the New Preston Congregational Church. The small car to the right of the hall is Charlie Gross's Singer Automobile. Charlie had an art gallery 2 houses behind the pavilion hall. The sign said gallery. His specialty was carved sandpipers. Sure would have liked to get one of them. In the upper right corner of the same photo is the home of my parents and in the home I grew up in. It was the only home they owned. Whoops, I forgot to switch that. So there are the sandpipers. I guess now would be a good time to talk about Halloween. The village came alive. The windows in town would be soaped or waxed. The wax being harder to get off. When the town got the first police car, a 1964 Plymouth, I saw someone talking to the driver while soaping the rear side window right in front of Dollar's garage. Later in the night was when the big guns would come out to decorate. Most of it would come from the farmers' junk piles. All kinds of items would be found on the roof of the Washington Supply Company and the balcony of the Pavilion Hall. Eggs and pumpkins would be smashed everywhere. One of the wildest pranks I saw was when someone shouted, "Watch out!" As we turned and looked, we saw car tires being rolled down Route 45 by the hall towards the center of town. 2 men had loaded up their station wagon with tires from Norman Couch's garage tire pile. They would have to park just so, as the car had no reverse gear. Can't believe the tires never hurt anyone or took out store windows. It was also one of the places we waited for the school bus. I believe every year a carriage or wagon was placed on the roof of the barber shop. I never saw it being done, but apparently there were masters of rope rigging. One Halloween, my cousin and I went to the drugstore and got some Nixon Lodge bumper stickers from Dutch Stoffler. There was a small arrow-shaped sign for Just a Mere Fruit Farm. We took the sticker and covered the words Fruit Farm so it read Just a Mere Nixon Lodge. Can't believe we did something so dangerous. One morning, I was late and missed the bus. Louise Pitts had just dropped off her daughter Jenny and was talking to her brother Bill Kurz, the carpenter. She asked Bill if he would take me to school in Washington. When we got to school, I opened the door and out rolled a beer bottle. At that age, it was the most embarrassing moment of my life. Just inside the doorway at the New Preston Pharmacy, there was a shelf for magazines. This was also being a place we got the bus stop. Most girls would be in the drugstore, and most boys would be on the porch or inside the supply company. One morning, a boy came to the bus stop complaining of a sore throat. He came into the drugstore and asked Dutch Stoffler to make him an ice cream cone. He seemed to think it would get rid of the sore throat. The first thing I remember about the drugstore was Nancy Pickett, my older cousin, behind the counter making cherry cokes and ice cream sodas. Another thing I remember was the table lamp that sat on the left showcase they used for a nightlight. I believe it was Chanel No. 5 advertisement. Leo Pickett III and I got a job of helping Honey Harold Stoffler remove the soda fountain and other items. One winter, I had the job of shoveling snow off the sidewalk in front of the drugstore. When Honey cleaned the basement out, When the business closed, many items were donated to the New Preston Congregational Church tag sale. Yup, there was the whipped cream canister and aluminum bases for ice cream sundaes, just calling my name. On the left side of the drugstore building was Ed Meeker's TV and radio repair shop. Back then, he would make house call repairs. People would leave their doors unlocked back then. When Ed would come to my parents' house, he could use his big box of TV tubes to protect himself from our dog Cindy, a toy fox terrier. She wanted no part of letting him in the house. I have been reminded by Duncan Woodruff there was a clothing store named the Corner Shop operated by Mrs. Irene Letterman after Ed Meeker moved his store to Washington Depot, but I don't remember this. I believe it was women's clothes only. Does anyone have photos of it? When I got my driver's license in 1966, gas was 32.9 cents per gallon at Dollar's Garage. They sold Esso gasoline. The car lift was just inside the front left window, so when a car had to be put on it, the other cars would have to be moved outside this area. Just outside this area was a pan full of water to test tire leakage. Harry and Marty Dollar allowed us to check our bike tires there. The right side of the office and behind that was a small parts room. Harry always had a small squirt bottle in his shirt pocket to wash your windshield. I always decorated my bike with flags, lights, bottle caps between the spokes, old motorcycle license plates, and reflectors. Marty Dollar used to tease me about my latest additions to my custom bike. One story I heard, when Joe Young bought a Hearst, he drove it to Dollar's, asking them to remove the casket, tracks, etc. to give him extra room. Mr. Johnson, who lived across from Beebrook Road on Route 25, now Route 202, worked for Dollar's at the time and said, "You're not getting me to work on that." Glenn Goldschneider was the only outsider that I ever knew who could pump his own gas there. He was a friend of Marty's. I thought it was pretty cool. I owned a 1956 Dodge I bought from Bill Jessen for $100. Bill said it was okay except for, quote, cancer on the rear fenders behind the wheels. I was having trouble with the brakes, so I brought it to Dollar's. I parked it outside the garage, and when Marty moved it inside, one of the lines blew. No brakes. Not quite sure how he stopped it, as I didn't have an emergency brake. We have a windshield ice scraper and owl keychain and road map from Dollar's Garage. Downstairs in the Dollar Garage building was Bob Nelson's plumbing business. He was the first person I knew of with an answering machine. He had it in his home on Baldwin Hill Road. My father called it Bob's Mechanical Man. He was very helpful, even if you called him on a Sunday morning. He would meet you at his shop or his home to get a faucet washer to fix your sink. Storage for the New Preston Church tag sale would be here also. There were many cars stored here, and my favorite was the 1950 Chevy Hot Rod. I don't remember much about the package store as a kid, only going in once in a while with my dad. Bill Jessen and his wife lived in the first part of the building and over the store. When Craig Nelson sold the business in later years, he gave me a can and bottle opener still in its box. Also from my parents' bar area, we have an empty clear bottle of vodka that has a Lake Warramog label on it. Crossing over Route 45 onto Main Street Extension was Lyman's store. I have a print of a 1944 picture of him in front of his store. Then it was Bud Gilbert's, who lived across the street in the little red house that became Egards. The Gilberts moved to California. The store was then owned by Kelly and Abe Zinnick. Eventually, it was solely Abe's store. Yes, there were 2 grocery stores in town in the 1960s. Abe's was much bigger than Kressel's. As a young guy, I worked there for a short time, sweeping floors and stocking shelves for $1 an hour. Also on Wednesday, I helped put away the delivery after school. The toughest job in the fall was the 20 cases of Campbell's tomato soup, as they had to be carried up the stairs to the top floor to be stored. Boy, were they heavy for a guy weighing 85 pounds. The shelf behind the cash register was full of Cascade dishwasher powder. I always wondered who in town had an automatic dishwasher, because I never had seen one. At the top of the stairs, on the upper floor, there was a flat door, a secret door straight ahead. It had about 1 inch cutoff, and bookbinding was completely covering it. I wondered why they did that. There was a trumpet on the upper floor. As I said earlier, Abe Zinnick ran the store when I was there, and he said his youngest daughter liked to play with that trumpet. On the end of this building was the post office. We had box number 134. Either Dad or I would go almost every day to check on the mail. It was opened between Zinnick's store and the post office until later years when they put in a door. If we forgot to go to the post office on Saturday, Abe would open the door on Sunday mornings. We have a photo of the inside of the post office in the 1940s, which came from Jerry Smith. It looked pretty much the same in the 1960s. One day, just before my birthday or Christmas, Mom told Billy Wyant and me to take my little red wagon down to the post office to pick up a package. Turned out to be a Marx train set. That was among my best gifts ever. One of my favorite pastimes was to look at the wanted posters in the post office. We always said, "I think I saw him." Louise Miller worked there, felt like forever. Her husband Charlie had a store in Marbledale. They lived on Flirtation Avenue. It was always a problem with parking there, especially in the winter. Joe Martin said it was one of the many reasons they needed to move the post office to Marbledale. Joe was one of my bus drivers and a janitor at school. Another reason for the move was that Zinnick's wanted more space in their store. Across Main Street was Camp's Barn, which is now the Village Smithy. When I was a kid, Norman Couch's garage stored many items there. Camps stored their personal items upstairs, plus the leftovers from Bill Jesson's father, who used the building as his blacksmith shop. The Gunn Museum has a picture of the building when he owned it. On the building, you could see a poster from the Great Danbury State Fair. The fair was a big deal, even for those in our town. My father, while working for Swanson Trucking, helped deliver vegetables to the Big Top for Arlene Yapel, who was in charge of that section. Sometime in the 1960s, the Camps let the New Preston Congregational Church use their section for storing tag sale items. The Camps would donate 1 oxen yoke per year for years, as there were many of them. In later years, when Norman Couch's business closed, the church was allowed to use the lower level of the barn. There was an old pickup stored in there. Does anyone know about this? There were other automotive items too. I remember 2 complete sets of glass bottles with metal spouts and carriers. that was how they used to put oil in autos. Sure wish I had gotten one of them. When Norman Couch used the lower part of the barn, they had removed the upright beams that support the upstairs floors, maybe to give them more room. The floors started to sag about a foot. The rear, dry stone retaining wall had moved in about 1.5 feet. I look back now and see how dangerous it was to be in there. When the smithy took over the property, they tore down the old building and built a new one. I don't know if any of the wood from the old barn is around, but I wouldn't mind having a piece or two. The old town shed was owned by Joe Young. It is another place I don't know much about. I think there were a number of restaurants in this building that overlook the falls. The view from the downstairs restaurant was unbelievable as you looked up at the falls. I know there wasn't much parking for this. I had only been on the upper floor at Halloween when they served cider and donuts. The night before the building was torn down, Craig Nelson and Dean Fraley took a chainsaw to the building and saved the restaurant sign, "A place to eat." Years later, Craig gave it to me. An unusual millstone was found when the building was being torn down. It was made in many pieces. The last time I saw it, it was on a skid not far from the side of the road. I wonder where that ended up. I feel it should have a place of honor. Down Lyman's Hill, Route 45, I assume named after Mr. Lyman, who owned Kelly Abezinnick's store. How many remember the state park at the base of the hill at Route 45 and then Route 25? The parking area is still there, as is the bridge to cross the East Aspetuck to get to the larger section. There were picnic tables and fireplaces on both sides of the bridge. It was nice, very well kept, and used a lot. One of our favorite summertime things to do was ride our bikes there at 5 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon, sit on the tables, and watch the hot rods and flat-toed race cars on their way home from the drag races in Dover Plains, New York. There was another pull-off on the left near Hip Road in New Milford. It was very common to pack a lunch for a trip or Sunday drive. Across the now Route 202 was Norman W. Couch's garage. It was a large Quonset hut with a windowed showroom added on. The Texaco gas pump sat right outside the showroom. I always thought that was a good idea, to have your gas pumped, oil checked, and windshield washed while you looked at all the new cars. To help airplanes find their way, New Preston and a north-facing arrow was painted on the roof. The new and used cars and trucks were kept on the left side. They had Chryslers, Plymouths, International trucks, and Scouts and Saabs. They were the 6th oldest dealer of Saabs in the United States. On the right side of the building, they kept their wrecked cars and cars that were not for sale. If you go to this property now, the only thing left of the business is the cement base for the street light on the right side closest to Christian Street. One of the biggest events of the year for teenage boys was the delivery of the new cars. The showroom windows were soaped over on the inside before they had the grand reveal on TV during the Dinah Shore show. You had to go inside to see them. They hid most of the cars at Alan Couch's house, which was over the bank from the old New Preston school, the Canavero property now. When word got out that the cars had arrived, we would make a beeline to take a look. We weren't brave enough to go down over the bank though. Back then, there wasn't much to see or do locally. Same thing if an accident happened. There would be a gathering at Couch's to see it. One time, Alan Couch was willing to give me a 1950 Studebaker 2-door. After Dad took a look, he said, "You don't need to get that piece of junk." I worked there for a week, starting the day after I got my license. I was too scared of damaging the cars, so I guess that's why they didn't keep me. We have an ice scraper from there. At the corner of Christian Street and Route 202 was James E. Curry Real Estate. I knew Mr. Curry from the New Preston Congregational Church, where I think he was in the choir. He lived in Woodville. I heard from Vi Dalatian, who owned the business after Mr. Curry, that the building used to be a tobacco barn. What I remember the most was the sign below the left front window. If you lived there, it said, "If you lived here, you'd be home now." People have read that and said, "What the heck does that mean?" In 1980, Vi, who now had the Chepaug Valley Real Estate, was my real estate agent and found my house for me. We have a key tag that was changed from Curry's to Vi's Real Estate. I also have the sold sign she never came back to claim. Does anyone else have a Curry or Vi's Real Estate sign? On the bank at the end of Christian Street was Beck's Kennel. I would like to know more about this. By the amount of dogs barking, it must have been a good-sized business. I do remember being told the well for the house was on the hill behind the house. It was gravity-fed. Nice, no pump to deal with. Just west of there was Green's Antiques. I barely remember this and don't remember the name of the business, but in later years, I believe he was a janitor at the New Preston School. He was a very nice man and lived in the last house on Anna J. Lane. Then came the lamplighter in that location owned by the Flynn family. The son Pete had racing boats and a Corvette, so that is why I remember him. I think he moved to Maine. I have a nice picture of the building with the 2 caddies out front, thanks to Honey Steffler. Down the road to the west was Dave Zinnick's store. The main reason we took the bike down there was because Cokes were 10 cents at Cressel's store and 5 cents at Dave's. If they weren't busy, they would be sitting at what we called the ice cream table and chairs. It would be Dave, his son Max, and sometimes Jerry Smith. That would have been a long walk for Jerry with his bum leg. I guess you would call Dave Zinnick's a tiny general store. He sold Gulf gasoline at his pumps. I heard a story that some boys were bothering him once, so he shot gasoline at them. I don't know if that is true. I believe he sold some pre-made sandwiches and had something to heat them up in.
Heat them up.
Heat them up. I think that was because it was a Greyhound bus stop. A later owner, Richie Meisner, gave me a Greyhound type table with Dave's name on it. Does anyone have any pictures of the store or gas pumps? Last stop is to Ernie Vincent's to get eggs. I think it was Sunday morning when Dad and I would go there. If you think the driveway to the Stone Mill Commons is steep and curvy, you should have driven down his driveway in the winter. You can still see the driveway where Cook's Antique Lumber sign is. Hard to believe the barn is still being used and the chicken coops are by the river. I don't remember if he had more buildings, but his house was at the far corner from the Stone Mill Commons building parking lot. I thought the road before Route 25 dipped so the house was at road level, but have since learned the house was moved down where the road construction happened. Now, I will start back at the Pavilion Hall, going towards Lake Warramog. Across Route 45 in recent years was the home of restaurants, but it used to be an apartment building. The Coulters lived downstairs. I don't remember the mother's name, but the father's was Sam. According to my parents, Sam was the best and fastest house painter in the area. He must have painted my parents' house at least twice over the years. They had 3 daughters, Susan, Carol, who was my age, and Ellen. I don't remember who owned it back then, but Homer Underwood owned it in the late 1950s and early 1960s, because my wife's parents had 2 siblings lived there when my wife was born in 1961. At night after supper from my parents' house, you could hear Homer with the backhoe and bulldozer until well after dark. That man was such a hard worker. And in the late 1970s, when I was looking for a house, Homer gave me many tips on what to do and look for. The next house towards the lake was located where the driveway to the apartment restaurant driveway is now. I was told the earlier barber shop was located in the downstairs, but I only remember it being vacant. The Cole family lived upstairs. They loved to sit on their upstairs porch. They had a tiny Rambler with 12-inch tires and a spare tire on the back, which was painted black and white. Most of the time, they parked the car in the Pavilion Hall parking lot. When the son Clyde was about 16 years old, he bid on and won a 1956 black Chevy that Cliff Couch donated to what I believe was the Lions Club auction held in Titus Park, about where the pantry is now. The first people I remember living in the next house on the right towards the lake were the Smiths. Don, the father, ran the Gulf station in Washington Depot. We have the plastic advertising horseshoes from there. Gulf no knocks puts extra kick in horsepower, is what they said. Don had the first garden tractor I had seen. I spent hours watching him plow gardens and snow, spraying fruit trees, mowing grass, etc. Anything with wheels always captures my attention. I heard he had one of the first German war brides. The house was eventually the Garnett's home. The next house on the right was where I grew up. Before my time, the Adams brothers owned Mom and Dad's house, and the Smiths next door. Janet Young told me the large barn that can be seen in the very old pictures of the Pavilion Hall was the Adams brothers' construction business, which you can see here. So this is my story. I can't believe how much I enjoyed writing this. I may have gotten some facts wrong, hopefully not many, but these were my memories. Sometime in the future, I plan to write a little story about the houses since torn down from the riverside of Route 45 from the Mill Road to the Beeman Woodruff Mill Dam. Keith Hinckley took some great pictures before they were torn down. If anyone has any old pictures to share, I would love to copy them. If you have any papers, signs, or New Preston stuff, I would love to add it to my collection. After I'm gone, it will go to the Gunn Museum. Wouldn't it be great to have rooms upstairs at the museum for each of the villages of Washington? Would anyone be interested in writing a short story about their memories growing up here in one of the villages? Lastly, I want to thank Robin, my wife, for her help keeping me on track to finish this story and editing it. And that concludes our presentation today. A walk through New Preston in the 1960s by Doug Mchan. And we are very fortunate enough to have Doug Mchan here in the audience. So if anyone has any follow-up questions for him, or if you'd like to add anything to what he wrote, or answer some of the questions that he posed in his paper, it would be great to do that. And Doug, I would like to thank you for writing this. I know it took a lot of time, and it's a treasure. We have no written history of New Preston. We have bits and pieces here and there, and I think what you wrote will be great not only for the present, but future generations to know what life was like in New Preston. And like you encouraged everyone, I would encourage anyone that has lived in town to please write your memories down on paper, and please share them with the museum. This is archived in the museum, and people will be able to access this now for a long time into the future. And it's so important to get these memories down on paper before we lose them. And if you're interested in writing about your section of town, or maybe a business you're involved with, or an organization, or a certain time period, or an event, please do so and get in touch with me. And we have a couple other people that I forgot to mention in the beginning. So these photos that you see here come from Doug Mchan. They come from the museum. Also Craig Nelson, Honey Steffler, and John Gunn, and others came from the Memories of Washington Facebook page. So thank you all for sharing your great photographs with us. And with that, we can open it up for discussion. Does anyone have any memories of New Preston that they can add to this, or do they have any questions for Doug?
What does Doug think about what they're going to do with the pavilion hall? What do you think about that?
I thought long and hard about it.
Yeah.
I'm very traditional, and I would love to see the town have it, but they've tried and they've tried and they've tried, and nothing ever sticks for very long. From what I understand, which I didn't know until recent history is the Pavilion Hall wasn't a town-owned building to begin with. It was a group of men that put it together. Originally, there was a tent put up by where the town beach is now, and they'd have parties and dances and one thing or another in the summer, and these men came up with the idea of having a permanent building. And I would think it would be better, because back then most people were farmers and stuff, and they would have a lot more time on their hands in the wintertime when they can use that heated building. But they lost it because they couldn't make enough money on it to keep the building going. And that's how the town ended up with it. And it's, there's been so many things go through there and nothing ever sticks. So they have agreed to keep the outside the same, and I don't think the inside of it is going to be changed all that much, because it'll be retail space. My understanding is it'll be retail space upstairs and their office is downstairs, because they have quite a business going on. In Millwright's kitchen, where they are now, I was up there a couple of weeks ago, and there was 4 people scurrying away on their computers. So they need the more room, and I think they're the right people for the job. So hopefully it'll stay at least the outside will look just like it has. So to answer your question, I think it's the logical thing to do. Because that other group of people, they wanted to raise money and give it to the town and let the town continue taking care of it. So, like Ray Underwood said, it would be just kicking the can down the road. Eventually, the chances are there'd be the same problem again.
At the top of the pavilion, is that a bell tower?
It was where the siren was for the. I'm not sure if it was just an air inlet to begin with, but I know when I was a kid, the siren was in there, because I lived just up the road and it was right level with my bedroom window. So when the siren went off, I knew about it.
So did I. I lived right back
Right back, yeah.
at that time.
Was it used for air raid and fire?
Oh yeah, there was practice for those. Yeah.
And what year did they stop using the sirens? Do you know?
Oh,
roughly?
you mean for fire notification.
Yeah.
Probably when we got pages back in the mid-80s, maybe a little bit after that. For a while they overlapped, but
Mhm.
the sirens would notify if there was a fire, they didn't say where it was. So
Yeah, I'm sure all the weekenders complained about that.
So what?
Yeah.
Doug, Tom, Rick, wondering if you have any, or anyone has any more information about some of the homes that stretch up through Preston Hill Road toward the west.
Not
to-
that
He's in Charlotte Fleet's house.
I'm
Oh,
sorry.
oh. Britain's. Yeah. Not that I'm aware of. Do you know, Stephen? I don't think so.
There's some in that Granny book.
Yeah, there's a little bit right in the there was an architectural study done of Washington in the year 2000 by Paul Graney, and he selected most but not all of the older homes in town, and there's a little history of each house, and this is found both in the Connecticut room at the Gunn Library and in the museum. It's a thick blue book, and I know they also have a copy at the town hall down on the lower level in the historic district planning and zoning office, and so there are little histories of some of the houses in there, and then there are just other tidbits. There's really not much about New Preston that has been written. There may be a little bit in the book. It's a history of New Milford and Bridgewater by Orcott. I think there's a little section on New Preston in there, and it may mention things like the Horace Bushnell House, which is on New Preston Hill. I haven't seen too much more. Sally, have you seen anything? Sally's one of our researchers at the museum, so she comes across a lot of this when she's doing research.
I think the Paul Graney book would be the best.
Okay. I know, getting to know the Fleets, since we bought their house, Lenny in particular is a treasure trove of stories.
I think you're writing them down.
Well, he should.
And the maps are great too. If you look at some of the old maps, they give the names of the people who used to live in those houses, and that's often a starting point to do research at the town hall, searching through property records and piecing a story together about your house. Any other folks from New Preston here that can add to the history? Janet or Doug or
What about the Gray Squirrel Inn, where the women's club is, or the New Preston Women's Club?
Right. So Doug has the signs from the Gray Squirrel Inn, right? Do you want to? You found them when you were doing some roof work.
Well, that was the first thing I found when I bought my house in 1980. One day I was up in the attic, and there was all this tin around the chimney, and I said, "Boy, I really should take that off of there and see what kind of shape the chimney was in." Because I was planning on using the fireplace till I found out it didn't draw. So I pulled it off. They're huge, and they were the two signs for the Gray Squirrel Inn with a 3-digit phone number.
So were they located at the bottom of Baldwin Hill or something?
Well, I assume, if I was going to guess, I would say there's maybe one of them was in front of the Pavilion Hall, and maybe one of them was at the bottom of Route 45 where it catches to, now it's 202. But it's just a guess. I've never seen them. Have you anywhere else?
No, I've never seen them in a
But,
picture.
they were just two old pieces of tin that somebody grabbed and they painted on them. You know how old Yankees, they reused everything. But they're one of my best treasures. But that was the first thing that got me going on all this.
I was wondering when it operated as, and when the women's club, Preston Women's Club.
The women's club have a history of it written down.
They have it on the website, it's on the website.
Oh, they do?
Yeah.
The women's club got it, I want to say in the late 1960s, early 70s, I used to be treasurer of the women's club. And
When?
Huh?
What?
Late 60s, early 70s.
Are you sure it wasn't way earlier than that?
Yeah, because it was after Bertie Corning died.
Hmm.
And it operated as an inn. The Smiths operated it as an inn. They were known for their chicken dinners.
And tea and
they had-
toast.
Huh?
tea and toast is what it says on my signs.
Well, my cards say chicken dinners too. And upstairs, they would rent out some rooms. I mean, there's only 1, 2, 3, 4 rooms upstairs, plus the bathroom. Or at least that's the way it used to be set up, so I'm assuming that at one point that was in the bathroom or whatever.
And one of them now is some kind of a fitness thing or
Well,
something.
yeah, ended up at the food bank. Or there was a community, co-op, that banded together, and they were using the downstairs of the women's club to sort out their room once they arrived. The room, as you walk in the front door and off to the left, the food bank used it for many, many, many years before they moved down to the pavilion hall.
Yep.
The AA uses it.
I kind of think they're still there.
I think they're pretty much there. But it was an interesting, and then the person, Bertie Corning used to collect taxidermy squirrels. That's how it come to name Gray Squirrel Inn.
They're still there as far as I know.
Huh?
They're still there as far as
I
I
don't know where.
The last time I was in there, my wife and I used to clean that for a few years, and they were still there then.
Yeah, because I was treasurer up until I think it was 80 or something like that, and there was nothing there, and I was all up through the attic and this and that. But I believe that I saw one of the items at a Litchfield auction that was held several years ago. Remember Pico Auction Gallery? Had it downstairs in his antique shop. And it was a humongous glassed-in display, a scene of done with squirrels. And supposedly, the women's club, or the inn, I should say, had been loaded with all types of taxidermy things. And when the women's club got the building, they ended up basically selling all the contents and everything else. No foresight.
Very interesting. And the people who came to vacation at Lake Warramug, I think, stayed at the Gray Squirrel Inn, right? You could board there and you could eat there.
Oh, yeah, you could do, I mean, with 5 rooms, you're not gonna board that many people. And then downstairs in the basement is the huge icebox freezer compartment.
Really?
You get to go down there and see, it's one of the largest ones I've ever seen.
Wow.
But there was also a summer kitchen off of the side. Of course, first of all, they've taken off the porch of the women's club now, so there's no porch in front of the house. And then there was a summer kitchen off to the side of the community house, where when the weather got hot, they'd go outside and on into this, what you call it, like a bandstand or whatever it is, that type of building, and did their cooking and brought it in. Of course,
And if you went up into the attic, you could also see that there was some major changes made over the years. Not that it makes any sense, but you could see where stuff had been cut and reset and this and that and the other. I don't know what
There
that
may
was
have
all
been
about.
rooms up there, because there were windows.
Well, I'm talking about the ceiling, the roof.
I
It
don't
was-
know at all about that. I know that
Well, if
I
you ever
had
go
a
in
fight
there,
with
take a
them
look at
because
this.
there was no insulation in the attic for the place. And they said, oh, yes, there is. We supposedly had so-and-so do the insulation. I said, well, he really took you down the road. Because he did half of the attic and not the other half. And I said, I'd call him right back and tell him to do, because they got charged for doing the whole attic. I found that out.
When was the town park or beach in Warmuck established originally?
They're in mid-60s. The bar and grill, the Lakeshore Pavilion, burned in 1963. It was a huge slab-sided structure. I've got a photo of it actually. Did you give me that postcard?
So the beach has
The
been
beach,
around.
the town took it over and bought it, and the late 60s, they started putting in sand, making, mowing the grass, this sort of thing. And then they acquired the boat launch at a later date, but I'm not quite sure.
It's always been popular and used a lot.
I think it's still used, I mean, I don't know how much, but.
I know it is
Even when
used.
when Bushman's had the lake shore there, they used to just let people,
There's a little beach down there
let
that
people use it. And you could go, if you looked at the building from the road, the left side was a bar, the right side was a dining hall. Well, in the afternoons when we go up there swimming, the kids were allowed to go into the dining room and there was a pass-through into the bar and you could buy potato chips there. You couldn't, you weren't supposed to go into the bar. But one time I went into the bar with my father and that was the first time I ever saw color television. It was I think it was the Rose Bowl parade. And that was quite a treat. I mean, the place was packed, but somehow Dad got me in.
Well, it's certainly an important gathering place today.
I'm interested in where Doug talks about the curtains on the stage inside the pavilion hall with
yes.
the advertisements. And Janet, do you remember anything about that, or who painted that?
We had plays there, didn't we?
Yeah, well, there was a huge canvas curtain.
Well, you know, I saw one of the fellas that had bought that, I saw him up at the thrift shop one day, and he said they were gonna, the curtain was no good, you know, as a curtain. They were gonna, I believe he said they were gonna frame it and
The
keep what they
curtain-
could.
I have searched that whole building and the curtain, because Duncan had told me when we worked on getting the Boys Club reopened, Duncan thought it might have gotten put up in the attic. Well, I grabbed a ladder and went right up there. There was no curtain there, and I have never found anybody, I can remember it, it was a huge painted picture of the lake, and then there was like advertising blocks that were all around it.
Well,
And
ask-
I would love to even see a picture of it,
Ask one of those fellas, go see them.
because I can't imagine where they would have gotten in if it wasn't in that building. And it, I can tell you, it was not in that building, because I looked everywhere for it. I will.
Yeah, go see them. Nice people.
Yes, I've met with them several times.
Do you remember who painted all the advertisements on the curtain?
No, I don't. I wouldn't know that.
Yeah, the only two I can remember was Couch Brothers Garage, which by then, when I would have been in there, he would have been down in New Milford. It was
48.
eventually Valley Dodge.
1948, my
And
dad.
Norman W. Couch was on there. I can't, those are the only two advertising blocks I can remember, but as I recall, most of the blocks were filled.
I don't know.
Great. Any other memories or stories about New Preston that anyone would like to add to this? Or any additional questions for Doug? Okay. Well, if there are no more, then we will call this a wrap for today. And again, I encourage you all to write down your memories. It doesn't have to be this long. It could just be a page. A page is wonderful too. Brief little snippets are great to add to the museum's archive. So please consider writing your memories down. And for those who would prefer to sit down for an oral history interview with me, that's another way to capture your memories. So we could also do that for you. Before we depart, I forgot to mention at the beginning, at one of our past programs, someone dropped a diamond earring here. And if it belongs to you, please get in touch with me, and I will get it to you. We want to get this back to its proper owner. So it was dropped at one of our last programs here at the Senior Center. So please reach out to me at the museum, and we'll get that back to you. Okay, well, that's it, and have a great summer.